Mom, tonight isn't just a retirement celebration, my son said into the microphone with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. It's also the beginning of a new chapter for you. The ballroom went quiet in a way that made the air feel heavier against my skin. Crystal chandeliers glowed above the round tables, reflecting softly against champagne glasses, and silverware polished so carefully you could see your reflection in them. Outside the floor-to-ceiling windows, the Chicago skyline shimmered against the dark April sky, elegant and distant. I sat at the center table wearing the navy blue dress I had bought for this occasion, the same color my late husband always said made me look dignified. 35 years as an elementary school principal. 35 years of arriving before sunrise, comforting crying children, helping exhausted parents, stretching school budgets with my own money when necessary. I thought this night was supposed to celebrate that life. Daniel raised his glass higher. My mother has spent her whole life taking care of everyone else, he continued smoothly. And now it's finally time for someone to take care of her. A few people smiled politely. Someone near the back clapped too early before awkwardly stopping. I noticed Vanessa standing beside him in a cream-colored dress with one hand resting lightly against his arm, her expression carefully arranged into something that looked compassionate from a distance. But I had known my daughter-in-law for 12 years. I knew the difference between kindness and performance. After a lot of discussion, Daniel said, glancing briefly toward Vanessa before looking back at the crowd, we decided to book Mom into one of the best assisted living communities in Illinois. The words landed softly at first, almost too softly for my mind to process. Assisted living community. Nursing home. The phrases floated through the ballroom, while every conversation died at once. I became aware of tiny sounds instead. The faint hum of the air conditioning. Ice shifting inside someone's whiskey glass. The distant traffic outside the country club. My fingers remained calmly folded in my lap, though I could suddenly feel my heartbeat in my throat. Vanessa stepped forward with a bright smile and clicked a remote control in her hand. The projector screen behind them flickered to life. Photos began appearing one after another. Pictures of me throughout the years. Me holding Teacher of the Year plaques. Me standing beside former students now grown into adults. Me smiling beside Daniel at his college graduation after I worked 2 extra summer jobs to help pay his tuition when his father got sick. Then the photos changed. A bright hallway. A neatly made bed beside a window. A smiling elderly couple playing cards in a common room. The logo of Rosewood Senior Living appeared across the screen in elegant gold lettering. We already reserved her suite, Vanessa said warmly to the crowd. Isn't it beautiful? Someone near the front muttered. Oh my God. I kept my eyes on the screen. A photograph of a small room appeared. Beige curtains. A floral comforter. A framed sign hanging beside the door that read Evelyn Carter. My name looked strange there, like it belonged to someone else already. Daniel laughed softly into the microphone. Mom always says she's tired of maintaining that big house alone anyway. A few nervous chuckles spread through the room. I looked around slowly. Former co-workers avoided my eyes. 2 retired teachers from my district sat frozen beside their untouched salads. My friend Carol looked horrified. Even the young bartender behind the marble counter had stopped polishing glasses. I could feel the humiliation settling over the room like smoke. But strangely, I didn't feel the urge to cry. I only felt cold. Vanessa moved closer to my chair and placed a hand lightly on my shoulder, performing concern for the audience around us. We just want what's best for you, Evelyn, she said softly enough to sound loving. Evelyn, not Mom. Never Mom. I lifted my wine glass carefully and took a small sip. The Pinot Noir tasted dry and bitter on my tongue. Daniel cleared his throat. Actually, he continued, reaching into the inside pocket of his jacket, there are just a few documents we'd like Mom to sign tonight so the transition can be smooth. There it was. Not concern. Not love. Transition. A transaction. I stared at the papers in his hand while memories rose quietly inside me like ghosts. Vanessa asking strange questions about my mortgage 6 months earlier. Daniel insisting I simplify my finances after retirement. Missing bank statements. Calls from insurance companies I never contacted. Tiny things I had almost convinced myself not to notice. Almost. I set my wine glass down carefully onto the white linen tablecloth. You planned all this? I asked quietly. Daniel smiled again, relieved I wasn't making a scene. Mom, this is for your own good. I nodded slowly, and smoothed one wrinkle from my napkin. Around us, nobody moved. Nobody spoke. Then through the enormous glass windows behind the ballroom, flashing blue and red lights suddenly reflected across the polished dance floor. The front doors opened, and 3 police officers walked inside. Nobody in the ballroom moved at first. It was as if the flashing red and blue lights outside had frozen every person in place. Daniel lowered the papers in his hand slowly while Vanessa's fingers slipped away from my shoulder. The projector screen behind them still displayed the photograph of that small beige room waiting for me at Rosewood Senior Living. My name remained glowing across the screen for everyone to see. Officer Rachel Monroe entered first, calm and composed in her dark navy uniform. 2 other officers followed several steps behind her. I noticed the guests immediately trying not to stare while staring anyway. The country club suddenly felt much smaller than it had 10 minutes earlier. Rachel's eyes moved across the room before stopping on me. "Mrs. Carter?" she asked gently. I nodded once. "Yes." Her voice remained professional but kind. "Would you mind stepping over here with me for a moment?" Daniel found his voice before I could answer. "Excuse me, what is going on?" Rachel turned toward him. "Sir, we are here regarding an ongoing financial fraud investigation." The room became so quiet that I could hear someone set down a fork near the back table. Vanessa folded her arms tightly across her waist. "There has to be some mistake," she said quickly. "This is a private family event." Rachel glanced toward her without changing expression. "Mrs. Carter contacted our office 3 weeks ago." 3 weeks. A murmur spread quietly through the ballroom. Daniel looked at me then, truly looked at me for the first time all night. Confusion flickered across his face. "Mom," he whispered. I kept my hands folded calmly in front of me. "I told you," I said softly. I was not confused. His expression changed slightly at those words. Almost like a memory was surfacing against his will. 6 months earlier, Vanessa had started correcting me constantly in front of people. Tiny things at first. "You already told us that story, Evelyn. You forgot your appointment again. You seem tired lately." The comments were always delivered with concern wrapped carefully around them, polished and harmless on the surface. But over time, they built something dangerous. Doubt. Not only in others. In me too. After Richard died 6 years ago, I learned how quiet a house could become. Our home in Oak Brook suddenly felt too large for one person. I still woke every morning at 5:30 because my body remembered decades of preparing for school mornings. I would make coffee in the kitchen while sunlight slowly crept across the hardwood floors Richard installed himself 20 years earlier. Sometimes I still expected to hear his footsteps coming down the stairs. Grief does strange things to time. Daniel started visiting more often after my retirement announcement. At first I thought he was worried about me being lonely. He offered to help organize my bills. Vanessa insisted on creating folders to simplify paperwork. They both spoke slower around me than they used to. Kinder. More patient. Like people speaking to someone fragile. One afternoon, I came home from lunch with my friend Carol and found Vanessa sitting alone at my dining room table with several papers spread in front of her. She startled when I walked in. "I was just helping organize your insurance documents," she said with a smile too quick to feel natural. I noticed then that one folder contained copies of my property deed. Another had forms related to medical power of attorney. "Why do you need these?" I asked. Vanessa laughed lightly. "Oh, Evelyn, we are just preparing for the future. Daniel worries about you living alone." The words should not have unsettled me as much as they did, but they stayed with me. That night, I opened my filing cabinet after they left and noticed something missing. My original investment portfolio statement. At first, I convinced myself I had misplaced it. Then my bank called 2 days later asking me to confirm a request to add an authorized secondary user to one of my accounts. I never made that request. I remember standing in my kitchen holding the phone while cold rain tapped softly against the windows. "No," I told the woman from the bank carefully. "There must be some mistake." After that, I began paying attention. Real attention. I bought a small notebook and kept it inside my purse. Dates. Phone calls. Missing documents. Strange conversations. Daniel asking detailed questions about my retirement savings. Vanessa insisting I should not drive long distances anymore because she worried about my memory lapses. It all sounded caring if you heard each moment separately. But together they formed something else entirely. Something calculated. Officer Rachel Monroe stood beside me now while the ballroom remained trapped in horrified silence. Daniel's face had gone pale. Vanessa still looked composed, but only barely. I noticed the tightness around her mouth, the quick rise and fall of her chest. "Mom," Daniel said carefully, taking one hesitant step toward me. "What exactly did you tell the police?" I looked at my son for a long moment. I saw the little boy who used to wait by the front window every afternoon for me to come home from work. The teenager who cried after his first heartbreak at 17. The young man who once promised he would always protect me after Richard died. Then I looked at the papers still trembling slightly in his hand. The transfer documents. The signatures waiting for me to disappear quietly into a room with beige curtains while they took the rest of my life apart piece by piece. "Enough," I said quietly, to finally start protecting myself. Daniel stared at me as if he no longer recognized the woman sitting in front of him. Around us, the ballroom remained suspended in uncomfortable silence, while people pretended not to listen and failed completely. I could feel their eyes moving between our family and the officers standing near the entrance. Vanessa recovered first. She always did. She straightened her shoulders slowly and stepped closer to Daniel, resting one manicured hand against his arm like an anchor. "This is ridiculous," she said carefully, lowering her voice into something softer and more sympathetic. "Evelyn has clearly misunderstood a few things." Officer Rachel Monroe did not react. "Mrs. Carter documented multiple unauthorized attempts to access financial accounts connected to her retirement funds and property assets," she said calmly. "We are simply here to continue that investigation." Vanessa gave a small laugh that sounded rehearsed. "Unauthorized? Daniel is her son. We help manage things because she gets overwhelmed." I noticed several guests exchange glances at that sentence. Overwhelmed. That had become Vanessa's favorite word lately. Not confused enough to alarm people immediately, just fragile enough to slowly erase my authority over my own life. I remembered the first time she used that word in front of others. It was Thanksgiving at their house last November. I had brought my pecan pie the way I always did, carrying it carefully through the front door while snow drifted softly outside. Their home smelled like rosemary turkey and cinnamon candles. Everything looked perfect in the polished way Vanessa liked. Halfway through dinner, I reached for the gravy boat and accidentally brushed against my water glass. It tipped slightly, spilling a few drops onto the tablecloth. Before I could even grab a napkin, Vanessa smiled tightly and said, "That is exactly why Daniel and I worry about you getting overwhelmed so easily lately." Everyone at the table went quiet for a second too long. Daniel looked uncomfortable, but said nothing. I cleaned the spill myself, while Vanessa continued talking as though she had not said anything unusual at all. Later that evening, I overheard her in the kitchen speaking quietly to one of her friends. "We are trying to transition her gently," she whispered. "You know how seniors can get when they lose independence." Seniors. Not Evelyn. Not family. Just seniors. Like I had become part of some category she was managing instead of a person who once helped build their lives. The strange thing about manipulation is that it rarely arrives loudly. It happens slowly. One comment, one correction, one carefully planted doubt at a time. By Christmas, Daniel had started repeating some of Vanessa's language without even realizing it. "Maybe you should stop driving downtown at night, Mom. Maybe it is time to simplify your finances. Maybe the house is too much for you now." Every sentence sounded reasonable on its own. That was what made it dangerous. Back in the ballroom, Daniel finally found enough composure to speak again. "Mom, nobody was trying to hurt you," he said quietly. His voice sounded strained now, smaller somehow. "We were only trying to help." I looked at him for a long moment before answering. "Do you know what your father said the day we bought our house?" Daniel blinked, clearly caught off guard. "What?" He stood in the empty living room with sawdust still on the floors and told me no one would ever make me feel powerless inside my own home. I paused briefly. That mattered to him. Daniel lowered his eyes. Vanessa stepped in before he could answer. "Evelyn, this is emotional thinking. Nobody is taking your power away." Emotional thinking. Another phrase she loved. As if concern for my own future were some kind of medical symptom. Officer Rachel turned slightly toward me. "Mrs. Carter, would you like to continue this conversation somewhere private?" Before I could answer, the ballroom doors opened again. A tall older man entered wearing a charcoal gray suit and carrying a leather folder tucked beneath one arm. I recognized Harold Bennett immediately, Richard's attorney for nearly 30 years. Daniel's expression tightened. "Why is he here?" Harold approached our table calmly. Because your mother asked me to be. His voice remained polite, but firm. Vanessa crossed her arms. This is becoming unnecessary. Harold ignored her completely. He opened the folder slowly and removed several documents. 3 months ago, he said, looking directly at Daniel, someone attempted to initiate preliminary conservatorship paperwork connected to your mother's estate. A visible wave of shock moved across nearby tables. Daniel frowned. What? Harold adjusted his glasses. The request included claims regarding cognitive decline and impaired judgment. Daniel turned toward Vanessa so quickly that her expression changed for the first time all evening. Not panic exactly, but something close. You told me those forms were only precautionary, he said quietly. Vanessa's jaw tightened. Because they were. Harold slid one document carefully across the table. Then perhaps you can explain why forged signatures appeared on 2 separate property transfer drafts. Daniel stared at the papers in disbelief. The color slowly drained from his face while the room around us disappeared into complete silence again. I watched my son standing there beneath the crystal chandeliers, finally beginning to understand that this night had never been about protecting me. It had been about removing me. Daniel kept staring at the documents in Harold Bennett's hands as though the words printed across the pages belonged to someone else's life. Vanessa reached for his arm again, but this time he pulled slightly away without realizing he had done it. The movement was small, barely noticeable, but after 12 years of watching my son orbit around his wife like a second moon, I noticed it immediately. Harold placed the folder carefully onto the table beside my untouched dinner plate. The preliminary filings were never completed, he said calmly, because Mrs. Carter contacted me before any legal transfer could move forward. Vanessa forced out a breath that almost sounded like a laugh. You are making this sound criminal. Officer Rachel Monroe answered before Harold could. Attempting to remove legal control of someone's finances through fraudulent medical claims is something we take seriously. Vanessa's face tightened. Fraudulent? Rachel nodded once. We interviewed the physician listed in these documents this afternoon. He never evaluated Mrs. Carter. A visible ripple moved through the ballroom again. One woman near the back quietly whispered something into her husband's ear, while another guest slowly lowered her champagne glass without taking a sip. Public humiliation changes shape very quickly when the room realizes the wrong person was being humiliated all along. Daniel finally looked toward Vanessa fully now. You told me the doctor recommended assisted living. Vanessa swallowed once before answering. He did recommend support. That is not what I asked. His voice remained low, but something inside it had changed. For months, I had watched my son speak to me carefully, cautiously, as though he feared upsetting Vanessa more than he feared losing me. But now uncertainty had entered his face in a way I had not seen since he was a teenager. I remembered another night years ago when Daniel was 16 and came home after crashing his father's car into a mailbox during a snowstorm. He stood in the kitchen shaking while Richard calmly asked if anyone had been hurt. Daniel admitted the truth immediately because he trusted his father more than he feared punishment. Richard always believed honesty revealed character faster than anger ever could. I wondered what he would think if he could see his son now. Vanessa straightened her posture. Daniel, they are twisting everything. Am I? Harold asked quietly. He removed another sheet from the folder and slid it across the table. This email was sent from your personal account to a real estate consultant regarding the valuation of Mrs. Carter's home. Daniel's eyes moved across the page. I watched the exact moment recognition hit him. You told me you were only researching future options, he said softly. Vanessa's voice sharpened slightly. Because I was. The email says, once she transitions, we can renovate before listing. She opened her mouth, but nothing came out immediately. Sometimes silence tells the truth before people do. I sat very still in my chair while the ballroom lights reflected against the polished marble floor beneath us. Strangely, I no longer felt embarrassed. Tired, yes. Sad, certainly, but not embarrassed. That feeling had already passed. It disappeared the moment I realized I had not imagined any of it. The missing papers. The whispered conversations. The careful suggestions that I was becoming incapable of managing my own life. Grief can make a woman lonely, but loneliness does not make her blind. Daniel looked at me again, and this time I saw genuine pain beginning to form behind his eyes. Mom, he said quietly, why did you not tell me sooner? I almost answered immediately. Then I stopped myself, because the truthful answer hurt too much. Instead, I looked down at my folded napkin for a moment before speaking. I tried. The words settled heavily between us. Daniel's face changed. Small memories were clearly surfacing now. The phone calls I made that he rushed through because Vanessa said they were late for dinner reservations. The afternoon, I asked him why someone contacted my bank pretending to represent my household, and he brushed it aside as a misunderstanding. The Christmas when I told him I felt uncomfortable signing unfamiliar papers, and Vanessa laughed gently before saying retirement was making me anxious. Every warning had been softened until it disappeared. Not because my son hated me. That would have been easier to understand. No, Daniel simply stopped listening carefully once someone else began narrating who I was becoming. Officer Rachel stepped slightly closer to the table. "Mrs. Carter," she said gently, "there are additional questions we will need answered regarding account activity and property filings, but that can happen later tonight or tomorrow." I nodded once. Vanessa suddenly looked around the ballroom as if noticing the crowd for the first time. Her carefully polished composure was beginning to crack under the weight of so many watching eyes. I could almost see her calculating which version of herself might still survive this room. The loving daughter-in-law, the worried wife, the overwhelmed caretaker. But the problem with manipulation is that once people notice the pattern, they cannot unsee it. Harold closed the folder quietly. "Richard Carter updated his estate protections before he passed away," he said calmly. "He specifically included safeguards against coercive transfers involving family members." Vanessa's eyes widened slightly. "What safeguards?" Harold looked directly at her. "The kind that activate when someone mistakes kindness for weakness." Daniel lowered himself slowly into the chair beside mine, the transfer documents still trembling in his hands. For the first time all evening, he looked less like a confident financial advisor and more like a little boy who had suddenly realized he opened the wrong door and could not close it again. The ballroom no longer sounded like a retirement party. The soft jazz music still drifted faintly through the ceiling speakers, but nobody was listening anymore. Plates sat untouched across the tables while guests pretended to focus on their desserts instead of the unraveling family at the center of the room. Vanessa remained standing beside Daniel, though the distance between them had become impossible not to notice. She no longer touched his arm. He no longer looked toward her for reassurance. I watched my son stare down at the documents Harold Bennett had placed in front of him, his jaw tightening slightly as he turned each page. "There are more emails," Harold said quietly, "and recorded calls from financial institutions confirming unauthorized inquiries regarding your mother's accounts." Daniel rubbed one hand slowly across his forehead. "Vanessa," he said carefully, "did you contact Mom's bank pretending to be authorized on her behalf?" Vanessa's eyes flashed briefly. "I was trying to protect our future." It was the first fully honest sentence she had spoken all evening. Not protect me. Not help me. Protect their future. Officer Rachel Monroe remained calm beside the table. Mrs. Carter also reported repeated pressure involving estate restructuring and assisted living placement despite no medical determination requiring supervised care. Vanessa let out a sharp breath. "You make it sound sinister." Rachel's expression never changed. "Attempting to isolate someone from financial control is something we investigate carefully." The word isolate settled heavily into my chest because that was exactly what it had been. Not all at once. Never all at once. First, Vanessa encouraged Daniel to host holidays at their home because my house was supposedly too much work for me now. Then she started answering his phone during evenings. "Daniel is busy right now, Evelyn. Daniel will call you tomorrow." Sometimes he did. Often he did not. Last February, I invited them over for Sunday dinner the way I had done nearly every week since Daniel was a little boy. I spent all afternoon making pot roast with carrots and mashed potatoes from Richard's old recipe card. The same meal Daniel requested every birthday growing up. At 6:15, Vanessa texted saying they would be late. At 7:30, she canceled entirely because Daniel had developed a headache after work. I ate alone at my dining room table while rain slid quietly down the windows beside me. The candles burned low before I finally blew them out myself. Later that night, I saw photos online of Vanessa and Daniel attending a charity event downtown with another couple. Daniel looked perfectly healthy in every picture. That was the evening I first allowed myself to ask the question I had been avoiding for months. Were they slowly removing me from their lives before removing me from everything else too? Back in the ballroom, Daniel slowly looked up from the paperwork. Did you forge medical concerns too? He asked quietly. Vanessa crossed her arms tighter. I never forged anything. Harold adjusted his glasses. A draft recommendation letter regarding cognitive instability was prepared using copied language from unrelated patient documentation. Daniel blinked in disbelief. What? The physician listed refused to sign it. Vanessa's composure cracked further then. Everybody is acting like I committed some horrible crime when all I did was try to prepare for reality. Several nearby guests exchanged uncomfortable looks. Reality, Daniel repeated softly. Vanessa finally turned fully toward him, frustration replacing performance at last. Yes, reality. Your mother is aging. She lives alone in a huge house. She forgets things. She trusts people too easily. Somebody needed to make responsible decisions. I noticed then that Vanessa still believed she was the reasonable person in the room. That was the frightening part. Not greed alone. Certainty. She had convinced herself that controlling my future was an act of intelligence rather than cruelty. Daniel looked exhausted suddenly, older than he had 2 hours earlier. You told me she wanted this. Vanessa hesitated. I told you she would eventually understand. Silence spread again between them. I remembered another silence years ago after Richard's funeral. Daniel stayed at my house that first night because he did not want me alone. Around 2 in the morning, I found him sitting quietly at the kitchen table, unable to sleep. I do not know how to take care of you without Dad, he admitted softly back then. I reached across the table and squeezed his hand. You do not have to replace him, I told him. Just do not disappear. But somewhere along the years that followed, grief and ambition and convenience slowly pulled him further away from me until Vanessa's voice became louder in his life than mine. Officer Rachel glanced toward me gently. Mrs. Carter, we should probably continue the formal discussion privately soon. I nodded once. My energy felt strangely thin now, not because of fear anymore, but because the truth had finally stopped hiding. There is a certain exhaustion that comes when your instincts are proven correct after months of doubting yourself. Daniel suddenly looked at me with something close to shame. Mom, he said quietly, did you really think I would take your house? I held his gaze for several seconds before answering. I thought you stopped asking yourself who was making decisions for you. His face fell at those words. Vanessa stepped backward slightly then, as though she finally understood that the room had shifted permanently beneath her feet. Nobody was looking at her with admiration anymore. Nobody saw the elegant daughter-in-law hosting a beautiful retirement party. They saw a woman who prepared a future for someone else without permission and nearly convinced an entire family it was compassion. The retirement party ended without anyone officially saying it was over. Guests slowly gathered their coats and purses in awkward silence, while waiters cleared untouched meals from the tables. Conversations became whispers. Eyes avoided direct contact. The giant projector screen behind us had finally gone dark, but I could still picture that beige room at Rosewood Senior Living waiting for me like a neatly wrapped disappearance. Officer Rachel Monroe spoke quietly with Harold Bennett near the ballroom entrance while the other officers remained nearby. Nobody was shouting anymore. The storm had passed its loudest point. What remained was the uncomfortable wreckage afterward. Daniel sat beside me with both elbows resting on his knees, staring down at the folded papers in his hands. Vanessa stood several feet away, now speaking sharply into her phone in a low voice. Even from a distance, I could see panic beginning to replace her polished confidence. For years she had controlled every room she entered through appearance alone. Perfect posture, perfect smile, perfect timing. But control becomes fragile once people stop believing the performance. Mom, Daniel said quietly after several minutes. Why did Dad never tell me about those estate protections? I looked toward the dark windows overlooking the city skyline. Because your father trusted family too much, I answered softly. Richard used to believe love automatically created loyalty. It was one of the few things we ever argued about during our marriage. He saw the best in people first. I saw patterns first. 38 years together taught us how to balance each other that way. When Daniel was young, Richard defended him constantly. He is figuring life out, he would say after every mistake. And Daniel usually did. He was not a cruel child. He was thoughtful once. Sensitive. I still remembered him at age 10 sitting beside me on the front porch after school because he noticed I looked tired. You work harder than everybody else's mom, he told me seriously while handing me half of his peanut butter sandwich. Small kindnesses like that stay with a mother forever. Which is why betrayal from your own child feels less like a knife and more like a slow erasing of something sacred. Daniel rubbed his face tiredly. I swear to you, I never planned to force you out of your house. I studied him carefully before answering. But you were willing to let someone else plan it for you. He closed his eyes briefly after that. Across the ballroom, Vanessa finally ended her phone call and walked back toward us, heels clicking sharply against the marble floor. Her expression had changed completely now. The softness was gone. The carefully rehearsed concern had disappeared. What remained underneath was irritation. We need to leave, she told Daniel quietly. He looked up slowly. Leave? Yes. Tonight has already become humiliating enough. I almost smiled at the word humiliating. Not because any of this felt amusing, but because humiliation had been exactly what she intended for me only an hour earlier. Public humiliation wrapped inside polite applause and champagne toasts. Daniel looked exhausted. Vanessa, did you ever actually care what Mom wanted? Her eyes widened slightly. Of course I did. Then why did you arrange a nursing home presentation before even speaking to her privately? She hesitated. Just long enough. Because you never make difficult decisions unless someone forces you to. Daniel stared at her quietly. I could see him hearing her clearly for perhaps the first time in years. Not just the words. The tone underneath them. Control disguised as efficiency. Harold Bennett approached our table again, carrying his leather folder beneath one arm. Mrs. Carter, he said gently, I arrange transportation home whenever you are ready. Home. The words settled warmly into my chest. Not facility. Not transition. Home. Vanessa crossed her arms tightly. This entire situation could have been handled privately. Harold looked at her calmly. Perhaps it should have been. Silence followed that sentence. Heavy and unavoidable. I thought back to 3 weeks earlier when I first walked into Harold's office carrying my notebook full of dates and observations. My hands trembled slightly while I explained everything that had been happening. The missing paperwork. The financial inquiries. The conversations designed to make me question my own judgment. Harold listened without interrupting once. When I finally finished speaking, he folded his hands together carefully and asked only one question. Evelyn, do you feel safe making your own decisions? I remember sitting there in the quiet office with sunlight falling across the carpet while realizing how long it had been since anyone asked me that directly. Not whether I was emotional. Not whether I was lonely. Not whether I was aging gracefully enough for everyone else's comfort. Simply whether my decisions still belonged to me. Yes, I answered him immediately. Because despite everything, they did. Officer Rachel returned, then holding a small stack of documents. Mrs. Carter, there are a few formal statements we will need later this week, she said kindly. But tonight you should probably rest. Rest. Another simple word that suddenly felt precious because it was offered instead of imposed. Daniel slowly stood from his chair and looked at me with red-rimmed eyes. Can I come by tomorrow? He asked quietly. Vanessa turned toward him sharply. Daniel. But he did not look at her. He kept looking at me. Waiting. I smoothed one hand gently over the front of my navy blue dress before answering. Tomorrow, I said softly. I think I would prefer some quiet. He nodded once without arguing. That hurt more than anger would have. As I rose from my chair, I noticed several former co-workers watching me from across the ballroom with expressions filled not with pity, but respect. And for the first time all night, I realized something important. Vanessa had planned this evening to convince everyone I was becoming powerless. Instead, she accidentally gave me the one thing she never intended to return to me in the first place. My own voice. I rode home from the country club alone that night in the back seat of a Blacktown car Harold Bennett arranged for me. Chicago shimmered quietly outside the window while light rain streaked across the glass in silver lines. My retirement bouquet rested beside me on the leather seat, forgotten during the chaos of the evening. White lilies. Pale roses. A satin ribbon that read "Congratulations, Evelyn" in gold lettering. Hours earlier, I thought those flowers represented the closing of one chapter in my life. Now they felt more like proof that endings rarely arrive the way people expect them to. When the driver pulled into my driveway, I sat still for a moment looking at the house Richard and I built together 32 years earlier. The porch light glowed warmly against the wet brick walkway. The maple tree near the mailbox swayed softly in the wind. Home. The one thing Vanessa kept trying to redefine as a burden. I unlocked the front door and stepped inside slowly. Silence greeted me immediately, but unlike the silence at the ballroom, this one felt honest, familiar, safe. I slipped off my heels near the entryway and walked into the kitchen without turning on the overhead lights. The small lamp beside the stove cast a soft amber glow across the counters. Richard used to leave that light on whenever he traveled for work because he knew I disliked entering a dark house. 6 years after losing him, I still kept the habit. I set the flowers down beside the sink and loosened the earrings from my ears carefully. My reflection in the kitchen window looked older tonight. Not weaker, just older in the way truth ages people quickly. I poured myself a glass of water and stood quietly listening to the refrigerator hum in the stillness. Then my phone rang. Daniel. I stared at the screen for several seconds before answering. Hi, he said softly. His voice sounded exhausted. Did you get home okay? Yes. Silence stretched between us. Finally, he spoke again. Vanessa went to stay with her sister tonight. I closed my eyes briefly. I should have felt satisfaction hearing that. Instead, I only felt tired. I see. Mom, he said carefully. I honestly did not know how far everything had gone. I leaned one hand against the kitchen counter. That is part of the problem, Daniel. Another silence followed. I could hear him breathing faintly on the other end of the call. I should have listened sooner, he admitted quietly. Yes, I answered. You should have. The truth sounded gentler spoken softly, but it still landed heavily between us. He cleared his throat. Can I ask you something? All right. When did you first realize something was wrong? I looked around the kitchen slowly while memories surfaced one by one. Not all at once, I said. That is the difficult part. It happened slowly. I remembered Vanessa reorganizing my pantry one afternoon without asking and laughing when I could not find where she moved things afterward. You really should write things down more often, she said brightly while Daniel chuckled from the living room. I remembered opening my closet and discovering several of my winter coats missing because Vanessa donated them during spring cleaning without telling me. You barely wear them anymore, she explained casually. I remembered finding brochures for senior living communities tucked between magazines on my coffee table as though someone wanted me to absorb the idea gradually, piece by piece, decision by decision, until eventually my own life no longer felt like mine. The first time I became truly afraid, I told Daniel quietly, was when your wife started speaking for me while I was standing right there. He said nothing after that because he knew exactly what I meant. Vanessa answered questions directed at me constantly. At restaurants. At doctor appointments. At family gatherings. Evelyn gets confused sometimes. Evelyn probably meant this instead. Tiny corrections delivered with smiling confidence until people slowly stopped asking me directly altogether. I never noticed how often she did that, Daniel admitted. Because you trusted her, I replied. Trust is not foolish, Daniel. But ignoring patterns can become dangerous. I heard him exhale shakily. Do you hate me? The question caught me off guard. I moved toward the kitchen table and sat down slowly before answering. No, I said honestly. But I am deeply hurt by you. Those words seemed to wound him more than anger would have. I kept telling myself she was helping, he whispered. I know. I thought we were preparing for the future responsibly. And somewhere along the way, I said softly, you stopped asking whether the future being prepared was actually mine. Silence settled heavily again. Then he spoke in a voice so quiet it almost sounded like the teenager who used to sit beside me after nightmares. Dad would be ashamed of me. Tears finally burned behind my eyes then, not because of the scandal or the documents or even the humiliation of the evening, but because for the first time in months, maybe years, my son sounded honest again. Your father believed people could come back from mistakes, I said carefully. But only if they fully faced them first. Daniel did not answer immediately. When he finally spoke, his voice cracked slightly. I do not know what happens next. I looked toward the staircase leading upstairs where framed family photographs lined the wall. Daniel at age 5 missing his front teeth. Richard teaching him how to ride a bicycle. Christmas mornings before ambition and influence and distance complicated everything. Neither do I admitted softly. But tonight was not the end of the story you thought it was. After we hung up, I sat alone at the kitchen table for a very long time with only the soft lamp glowing beside me. Outside, the rain continued falling steadily against the windows. For months, I had been treated like someone fading quietly into the background of her own life. But sitting there in the silence of my home, I realized something important. I was not disappearing. I was finally being seen clearly again. The next morning, sunlight spilled across my kitchen floor in long, pale rectangles, while coffee brewed quietly beside the stove. For the first time in months, I woke without immediately feeling anxious inside my own home. The exhaustion remained, but the confusion was gone. There is a strange kind of peace that arrives once manipulation finally loses its grip. I stood at the sink watering the small basil plant near the window when my phone buzzed with a text from Carol. "Half the district is talking about last night. Everyone is on your side." I stared at the message for a moment before setting the phone back down. All my life, I avoided becoming the center of uncomfortable attention. I spent decades solving problems quietly for other people while keeping my own pain private. Yet somehow the most humiliating night of my life had also become the night people finally understood what had been happening to me. Around 10 o'clock, Harold Bennett arrived carrying another leather folder beneath his arm. He sat across from me at the kitchen table while steam curled upward from untouched coffee cups between us. "How are you holding up?" he asked gently. I considered the question honestly before answering. "Lighter than I expected." Harold nodded slightly, as though he understood exactly what I meant. "Officer Monroe informed me additional financial records surfaced overnight," he said carefully, "including evidence of attempted account restructuring connected to Vanessa's personal business debts." I looked up sharply. "Debts?" Harold opened the folder slowly. "Significant ones." He slid several printed statements toward me. "Credit cards, luxury retail balances, private club fees, investment losses." I stared quietly at the numbers while something cold settled into place inside me. It had never truly been about my well-being. It had not even really been about aging. It was about money collapsing behind polished appearances. "Daniel knows?" I asked. Harold shook his head once. "Not everything yet." I leaned back slowly in my chair. Suddenly, so many moments became painfully clear. Vanessa insisting on expensive renovations for their home last year. Her obsession with social status. The constant pressure for Daniel to maintain appearances even after he admitted work had become stressful. She was not simply trying to control my future. She was trying to stabilize her own. My phone rang then. "Daniel." I hesitated before answering. "Hi, Mom." His voice sounded rough, like he had not slept. "Hi." Silence lingered briefly. Then he spoke carefully. "I went through our financial records this morning." My grip tightened slightly around the coffee mug. "And?" I asked softly. He exhaled shakily. "I found accounts I never knew existed." I closed my eyes for a moment. "Daniel." "There were loans," he continued quietly. "Personal loans. Credit lines." Vanessa moved money between accounts without telling me how bad things had become. He sounded less angry than devastated. Like someone standing inside the ruins of a life he thought he understood. I kept believing her explanations, he admitted. Every time something felt strange, she had another reason ready. I thought about how often manipulative people survive by exhausting everyone around them with constant explanations. Confusion becomes its own kind of control after a while. "Mom," Daniel said softly, "I do not know how I missed all of this." I looked toward the framed photograph hanging beside the hallway entrance. Richard holding Daniel on his shoulders at a 4th of July parade nearly 30 years earlier. Both of them smiling directly into the camera. "Because you trusted someone you loved?" I answered quietly. "That is human. But trust still requires responsibility." He went silent again after that. Then finally, in a voice filled with shame, he asked, "Did she really try to move you into Rosewood permanently?" The question hurt more than I expected because hearing my son finally say it aloud made everything real in a way documents never could. "Yes," I answered honestly. "I believe she did." He inhaled sharply. "Without even asking what you wanted?" "No," I said softly. "Not without asking." He paused, confused. "What do you mean?" I stared down into my coffee for several seconds before answering. People like Vanessa ask in indirect ways first. They test boundaries slowly. They introduce ideas casually. They watch whether anyone pushes back. I remembered every brochure left casually on my counter. Every conversation framed as concern. Every little suggestion that my life had become too large for me to manage. None of it happened suddenly. That was why it almost worked. I think, I continued quietly, she stopped seeing me as a person somewhere along the way. I became a problem to organize. Daniel made a sound that almost resembled a broken laugh. God. Harold remained silent across the table, respectfully looking away while I spoke with my son. Vanessa left me 23 voicemail messages last night, Daniel admitted. Half of them blaming you. Half of them crying. I felt no triumph hearing that. Only sadness. And what do you think now? I asked carefully. He did not answer immediately. When he finally spoke, his voice sounded hollow. I think I spent years letting someone rewrite my relationship with my own mother. Tears burned unexpectedly behind my eyes then because, despite everything, hearing him finally understand mattered more than I wanted to admit. Outside, a delivery truck rolled slowly down the street while wind rustled through the maple tree near the porch. Ordinary sounds. Ordinary life continuing. Mom, Daniel said quietly, I know I cannot fix this overnight. No, I answered softly. You cannot. Another silence settled between us. Not hostile this time. Just honest. Finally he asked, would Dad really have protected you from all this? I looked around the kitchen Richard once painted pale yellow because he said it made gloomy winters feel warmer. Your father protected me by reminding me who I was, I said quietly. That is why this almost worked after he died. Nobody was there repeating it anymore. When the call ended, I sat very still at the table while sunlight slowly climbed higher across the floorboards. Harold closed his folder gently before speaking. Mrs. Carter, he said, what would you like to do now? I thought about that question carefully because for months every decision around me had been shaped by someone else's agenda. Fear, convenience, control. But now the house was quiet again. My thoughts belonged fully to me again. And for the first time in a long while, the future felt like something I could still choose for myself. 3 months later, the maple tree outside my front porch had begun turning gold with early autumn. Chicago mornings carried that familiar crispness in the air again, the kind Richard used to love because it meant football season and cinnamon coffee cakes from the bakery downtown. I stood in the kitchen one quiet Saturday morning wearing an old gray sweater while sunlight drifted softly across the counters. The house no longer felt heavy. That surprised me most. After everything that happened, I expected bitterness to settle permanently into the walls. Instead, the room slowly became mine again. Not because anything magical erased the pain, but because peace returned one honest decision at a time. Daniel and Vanessa separated 6 weeks after the retirement party. He told me the final argument happened after he confronted her about additional financial accounts hidden. Under a consulting business she never actually operated. According to Harold Bennett, most of the legal investigation eventually shifted toward financial misrepresentation rather than anything involving me directly. I did not follow every detail closely. By then I no longer wanted my entire emotional life tied to Vanessa's choices. Some people consume enough of your years already. You do not owe them your future too. Daniel visited me carefully at first after everything happened. Like someone approaching a house after a storm, uncertain which parts remained standing. The first time he came over alone, he stood awkwardly in the doorway holding grocery bags like a nervous teenager. I brought soup, he said quietly. You always liked the wild rice one from that deli near Oak Street. I stepped aside to let him in without answering immediately. Trust does not return through speeches. It returns through consistency, through humility, through time. We ate lunch together at the kitchen table where Richard and I once helped Daniel finish 4th grade science projects and college applications. Some conversations were uncomfortable. Others were quiet. But for the first time in years, nothing felt managed. No interruptions. No carefully redirected topics. No voice hovering nearby correcting my memory or speaking on my behalf. Just my son sitting across from me honestly. I keep replaying everything, Daniel admitted one afternoon while stirring cream into his coffee. I do not understand how I became someone who almost let another person decide where his mother belonged. I looked at him carefully before answering. It did not happen all at once. He nodded slowly because now he understood that better than anyone. Manipulation rarely arrives wearing cruelty openly. Sometimes it arrives sounding practical, responsible, efficient. It tells you difficult decisions are acts of love until eventually you stop questioning who benefits from those decisions most. Daniel started therapy not long after Vanessa left. He told me one evening that his therapist said something which stayed with him. Control often hides inside the language of protection. I remember sitting very still. After hearing that, because it explained nearly everything about the past 2 years. The brochures, the paperwork, the comments about memory and aging. None of it sounded cruel individually. That was why it became so dangerous. Meanwhile, I made changes of my own. Not because I was forced to, because I wanted to. I hired a financial advisor Harold recommended who answered questions directly to me instead of around me. I updated my estate documents personally. I joined a retired educators volunteer program twice a week helping children struggling with reading comprehension. The first afternoon, I walked into that elementary school library again, surrounded by tiny chairs and shelves filled with worn picture books. Something inside me woke back up. A little girl named Sophie sat beside me sounding out difficult words with fierce concentration while sunlight poured through classroom windows. "Did I do good?" she asked after finishing a page without help. I smiled at her proudly. "You did excellent." Driving home afterward, I realized it was the first time in nearly a year that I felt useful instead of managed. Alive instead of supervised. One chilly October evening, Daniel came over carrying an old cardboard box from his attic. "I found these while cleaning," he said softly. Inside were family photographs Richard stored away years ago. Birthday parties. Camping trips near Lake Geneva. Christmas mornings with wrapping paper covering the entire living room floor. Daniel sat beside me on the couch while we flipped through the albums together slowly. At one point, he stopped at a photograph of me standing beside Richard during my first year as principal. I looked younger then. Confident. Certain. "Dad looked at you like you were the strongest person in the world," Daniel murmured quietly. Tears burned unexpectedly behind my eyes. "Your father reminded me of who I was whenever life tried to make me smaller," I said softly. Daniel stared down at the photograph for several seconds before speaking again. "I should have done that too." I reached over and rested my hand gently against his. "Then do better moving forward," I answered. "That matters more than endless guilt." Outside, wind rustled through the golden leaves lining the street, while evening settled softly around the house. For a long time, neither of us spoke. We simply sat there surrounded by old photographs and quiet understanding. The strange thing about betrayal is that people assume the deepest wound comes from losing trust in someone else. But that is not entirely true. The deepest wound comes when you slowly stop trusting yourself. When another person convinces you your instincts are irrational, your independence is dangerous, your voice is inconvenient. That was the real thing I nearly lost. Not my house, not my savings, myself. And sitting there beside my son in the warm glow of the living room lamp Richard once picked out 30 years earlier, I realized something important. Aging had never made me weak. Loneliness had simply made me easier to silence for a while. But silence and weakness are not the same thing. They never were.